Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto, the Manx Center, and the workshop on the question whether the Arab-Israeli conflict has a rational solution. To me, this workshop is a dream come true. For years, I have been asking the question whether the Arab-Israeli conflict has a rational solution and could not find an adequate answer. What best, then, to invite some of the brightest minds in the world to think about this question and about the extended question, what is rationality, that the conflict may end up in a rational way. These questions are critical not only from a political perspective, but also from a theoretical perspective, philosophical perspective. I'm thrilled and very grateful that you have agreed to attend this workshop, and to Tom, Danny, and John, who also agreed to enlighten us with special lectures about rationality more generally. As you see, I'm using first name because this is an informal workshop, a brainstorming conversations among friends. Unfortunately, Danny has to cancel his attendance to the workshop due to personal reasons, although he's coming later this afternoon to deliver his rationality lecture and will be with us in the remaining events. But I also hope that he will be able to attend the tail end of the workshop. He arrives at 1, so maybe by 2 o'clock he will be here and he will join us if it's not held by traffic. The workshop, as announced, is closed to the general public, which will enable us to talk freely and without any constraints. But we are very fortunate about the presence of Mr. Charles Bronfman, who endowed the chair I hold. As you can see around, we are also accompanied by 10 observers: Professor David Cameron, head of the Political Science Department, Professor Stephen Bernstein, head of the Center of International Studies at the Manx Center, and 8 graduate students who were handpicked to participate in the event. In spite of the fact that the workshop is closed to the public, and unless we decide otherwise it is off the record, we have made arrangements to videotape the entire session. If there is just one dissension to abstain from videotaping, then we will stop. If you agree, however, at the end of the workshop, if you agree to videotape, and then at the end of the workshop, I will ask you whether you are okay with placing the tape in the Manx Center website, so other professors and students can see profit from our discussions. But if we decide against this option, the tape will remain in the center's archive for academic use at a future mutually agreed time. I will moderate the workshop discussion, and after some acknowledgements, very short presentations, introductory remarks by Charles, I will suggest an agenda to get us going. Time is at the premium. I would thus be grateful if, without imposing any constraint on your interventions, we can keep comments as short as possible. This event would not have been possible without Charles Bronfman General's help. Thank you very much, Charles, for your continued support and trust, and hope you will enjoy this workshop in the Rationality series. When I first conceived the workshop idea, Andy, Charles' wife, was still alive, and I'm sure if it had not been for her untimely and tragic death, she would be present here and would have enjoyed the event, because very much like you, she searched path to peace, which so far has eluded us. I also would like to thank the Manx Center for being an academic place with vision that supports cutting-edge research, needless to say, making this event possible both financially and organizationally. In particular, I would like to thank Janice, director of the Manx Center, who not only supported and became involved in the workshop idea from the very beginning, but who also helped conceive the Rationality series and did everything in her power to put it in practice. As always, Janice, Javera, thank you from the heart. I also would like to thank Professor Bernstein for lending the support of the Center of International Studies. Most special thanks should equally go to the Political Science Department, where the Bronfman Chair of Israeli Studies is located, for lending practical, moral, financial, and organizational support for this project from day one, and in particular to Professor Cameron, Chair of Political Science Department, to Professor Rob Vipont, former Chair of the department, both of whom helped put together this project. Your encouragement and confidence in the project's success is really important to me. I also want to thank the Dean's Office, Arts and Sciences, in particular to Dean Pekka Sinervo, who personally saw that the project comes to fruition. In addition, I thank the Office of the Vice President and Provost, and personally to Provost Vivek Goel and to Malin Harding for their financial support. I also would like to thank and pay tribute to a large number of staff members, all of whom I'm deeply indebted for their organization and personal support. At the Political Science Department, I would like to particularly thank Rita O'Brien, who skillfully co-piloted the project organization, was in charge of the purse, and provided advice and support more than she was willing to admit. I also would like to especially thank Joan Collis and Leanne Thomas, Maria Alice Bailey. At the Manx Center, I would like to thank its managing director, Marquita Evans, and Nina Boric, Sean Willett, and Tina Logopoulos. I'm also grateful to Nadina Jamieson from the Dean's Office for her support. But most special thanks go to Marianne Martin, who was responsible for organizing the workshop. She's over there in the corner. And the Rationality series from A to Z in the most professional way. She's with us not as an organizer of the, or not only as an organizing of this conference, but one of the 8 students selected, graduate students selected to observe our talks. Marianne, you did a tremendous job, and I thank you. Last but not least, I also thank Sylvia, my wife, not only because as part of the Manx Center and the Dean's Office helped in the organization of the event, but also because she had to put up with me saying what I say too often: I will be busy this week, but next week will be better. I suggest that we now go around and introduce ourselves, including the outer circle. I then will invite Charles to say some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to work. So, Janice, if maybe we could go this way. Thank you.
Janice Stein, the director of the Monk Center.
Charles Brown.
Sarin Sebi, I'm at Quds University, East Jerusalem.
Directing the Rationality Center in Jerusalem.
Jan Elster at the Collège de France.
I'm Tom Schelling. I'm retired both from Harvard University and the University of Maryland. And everybody's going to have to speak louder for them to hear each other.
We're going to need microphones. Do you have them?
Yeah, well, microphones we have over here. I think we got instructions about the mic, right? Tom, so, just to hear. Emmanuel Adler, University of Toronto. Why don't you, the students, just say your names so we'll...
Loudly.
Loudly.
Marian Martin, MA.
I am James McGee, PhD in Computer Department.
Rebecca Sanders, PhD student in
Arthur Zellickman, MA Political Science.
Charmaine Stanley, PhD Political Science. Patricia Reva, PhD in Relations.
Arjun Tremblay, PhD Political Science.
Good. Thank you very much. Charles, the floor is yours. Thank
I
you.
don't know if I just put the microphone on or not.
You did if it's a green light.
Yeah, if it's a green light, it is.
Mike, there you go.
Oh, there we are. As time is of the essence, I will be extremely brief. I am delighted to have had the pressure from Rose Wolf to have established this chair, and I am delighted that Janice chose Emmanuel, and I am delighted that Emmanuel has chosen all of you to have this symposium, and I look forward with great anticipation to listening to you and learning more than I now know. My only problem is that I was ill-advised by my office and I have to leave at 12:30. So I will walk out very quietly. But God bless, good luck, and I think you're quite right, Emmanuel. Had Andy been alive, she would have been here and would have enjoyed every minute.
I know.
I regret that very much.
Thank you very much. In front of you, you have an agenda that I have prepared. I'm going to go through very quickly, and then we'll start to work. As I'm going to say, although this is aimed to create some structure, you are completely free to take the conversation in whatever direction you like. So let me start. I have taken the initiative to convene this workshop because I believe that although it may seldom happen, sometimes academic knowledge may help mitigate human conflict. And I say, ask Thomas Schelling if you are skeptical. That, however, was the Cold War, but can our best and latest understanding of rationality, practical reason, and psychological and sociological processes affecting decision-making help us say something new and important about solving the Arab-Israeli conflict? We obviously are not searching for a technical fix to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we do not agree about everything. Some of you say that there is a rational solution and a focal point, and it's well known. Others that there is the problem is the process. Others say that there is no rational solution and that there is no problem. I suggest that we discuss this and other issues about rationality and non-rationality less in the abstract, although your theoretical points of view will be most welcome, than by focusing mainly first on the problems or social traps that impede the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and second, on the nature of solutions. When I say nature of solutions, I do not mean talking about the nitty-gritty, what they are talking, let's say, in Jerusalem these days, but in terms of our subject. I suggest, but of course, as I said, you can take the conversation in other directions, that until noon, approximately, we talk about the nature of the problems. From noon to 3, we talked about the nature of the solutions. And from 3 to 4, approximately, we talked about the project's future. We'll have a 15 minutes coffee break at 11 and lunch between 1 and 2. From our memos, I distilled 10 problems and 5 solutions. A 2-to-1 ratio may be the first sign of progress this morning. Could have been 5-to-1 or 10-to-1. If you agree to this agenda, I will quickly state the problems and solutions, and we'll begin the discussion. The problems. First, lack of common knowledge about the nature of the game and lack of common values, compounded by subjective rigidity stemming from fixed identities, as in Sari's negotiation models and paradoxes. Identity, says Janis, takes us to the heart of the conflict. Yazid, however, argues that identities have changed but for the worse. This raises 2 questions. First, can deep identity conflicts be rationalized in a Weberian sense? And second, how can you change yourself in order to change the other without destroying yourself and your identity in the process? Second, too much rationality. For example, as John ponders, the best responses that parties choose when driving toward equilibrium in a prisoner's dilemma situation may prevent the parties from attaining mutually advantageous compromises. Rationality, as Edna and Yazid point out, may also lead to undesirable political and human consequences. Third, too little rationality. In Johnny's words, irrationality. Emotions and passions such as fear, honor, and dignity. Or as Joel said, the prevalence of redemptive politics. And may I add, the social construction of physical things as sacred. This may be why, as Michael says, the parties are driven to give up present community life and identity for the sake of future redemption, which to him means watching mutual national suicide. Yazid wisely cautions us, however, to take rational emotional processes as mutually constitutive. 4, the depth and strength of the lack of commitment to a solution. Are we really stuck if, as John's test, the parties are not actually strategically posturing? Can a rationality process or Perez tunnel be built out of emotional stuff? Jenny says yes, and we should discuss that. 5, the spoilers. Danny calls this the problem the school syndrome scenario, the ability of radicals to blow up each other's school as soon as the peace process resumes. He challenged us to tackle it, and we will. Why, for example, isn't self-restraint the solution? Think about it. Israelis know they are being provoked, so the rational thing to do is not to react, but they react religiously. Palestinians know it is in their ability to break the chain between suicide bombing and reprisals, and that doing so may lead to a viable Palestinian state, but they don't. Why? What is the mechanism involved, and can it be defeated? Is it about emotions that enter domestic politics? Does it have to do with the deep internal divisions on both sides that Yon talks about? Is it about the ontological injunctions rather than instrumental decisions? Also, as Yon says, even if there were an agreement between the main parties, the outer areas of the Muslim world, Iran perhaps, can still be spoilers. The problem, thus, is also the unraveling of the agreements and the need to make agreement renegotiation proof, as he says, maybe perhaps at the regional level. 6, the process simultaneity and sequential nature, which may require one side to go first in making sacred concessions. What side, the stronger or the weaker side? Which is which? 7, time, whether the parties conceive historical processes and the future to be on their side. Thus, for example, if Palestinians believe that Israel will eventually disappear, as all colonial enterprises have, then why bother making concessions? Or if Israelis believe that the clash of civilizations with the Muslim world is inevitable, again, why bother? Moreover, as Yazid mentions, there is the question about short and medium-term solutions as opposed to long-term solutions. We may be stuck in time fighting the last peace, while the problem may already have evolved in a way that we may neither realize nor understand. 8, lack of authoritative and credible leadership, as Edna, Avishai, and Michael say. 9, whether the difficulties in identifying the nature of the problem and the Archimedean moral lever, as in Sari's indeterminate negotiation game, stem from intellectual or moral failure, from lack of shared understanding of the conflict's complexity, perhaps also of reciprocity norms, or from the inability, and here I'm borrowing from Avishai, not just to forget, but also to forgive. Moreover, if, as Yazid said, defining problems and solutions is power, are the sides caught in an endless struggle for power to frame problems and solutions their way, which means never reaching the solution stage? Finally, a structural paradox. It is dumb if you do cooperate or exercise self-restraint, and dumb if you don't cooperate and exercise self-restraint. This paradox really is a combination of two international relations paradoxes. The liberal paradox, according to which mutual advantage are trumped by fear of becoming a sucker, and the realist paradox, according to which lack of cooperation results from the self-fulfilling of prophecies. And now to the very short to the 5 solutions. 1, reflexive action, learning, reframing. Joel would like the parties to learn to think about politics in non-linear and interactive ways. And Yon believes that the parties may mutually profit from reflexively abandoning instrumental best responses. Following Danny's prospect theory, Johnny sees a solution in reframing the problem as one of mutual loss, as in Michael's mutual suicide. Fear of losing life and identity may lead actors to postpone redemption. According to Michael, reframing may take an actual catastrophe, a major war perhaps. But as Johnny says, social entrepreneurs have in the past been able to mobilize the masses despair to stop spoilers. I add that there are recent examples in history. For example, the end of the Cold War and end of apartheid in South Africa, which were characterized by reframing and learning without catastrophe. Edna and Yazid say that we should first learn why the Oslo process failed. Second, changing self in order to change the other, thus changing the structure of the situation. This may require not just empathy, as Yazid says, but also, as Sari says, constructing the intersection point of the game and the Archimedean moral lever. The latter should be, Sari very incisively says, secular faith in life after the conflict. Perhaps another suggestion, Mediterranean shared identity based on fair compromise between life and justice. 3, learning from historical precedents. As Yon indicate, we may draw lessons from the French War of Religion, which fortification and separation brought to an end, a solution that probably will not apply to Jerusalem. The 30 Years' War, on the other hand, came to an end partly with changes in the rule of political game, the creation of state and international systems, and norms governing state interaction, which brings me to number 4, the fusing. The fusing means changing the party's expectations and dispositions by restructuring social reality, in this case, the Middle East rules of the game. Although the trigger of the fusing may be a shared threat, perhaps Iran, it can be had only through bold, path-breaking and dramatic initiative, which may require concerted international action and leadership, mainly US leadership, and a sense of crisis and urgency. I mean really having something like a grand post-war settlement without the grand war. The coming to terms with the notion that a nuclear holocaust was likely helped diffusing the Cold War. The notion that the present situation may be leading to total chaos and loss of communal identity, what Anthony Giddens called ontological security. Insecurity, sorry. Perhaps also a clash between the West and the Muslim world may become a lever for diffusing the Arab-Israeli conflict. And finally, bringing about reflexive change, learning, self-change, diffusing, all these other things in practice. In other words, moving ideas from the hold of I-learning to the holds of government. How do we translate the suggested solutions into practical political steps? How do we go about practically promoting reframing? What social mechanisms can practically help overcome Danny's school syndrome scenario? We thus need theoretically based political pragmatic, thank you, Janice, for the concept, or praxis which is conceptually driven toward rationalizing conflict resolution processes. In the workshop last hour, I will suggest a few ideas about how we can engage in theoretically based political pragmatic. So let us get started, and I will start, in fact, a solution that I will, a question that, in fact, I will ask Tom, because everybody has sent a memo, and Tom said that he would study very carefully your memos, and so we are eager to see what he has to say. So my question is, sort of leading question for the beginning, if we have to think about, we have to identify one problem all other problems are derivative from, the mother of all problems, which one would it be, whether it's related to rationality? Tom.
I noticed that you define it right at the beginning as the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right.
And what my suggestion was going to be is that one of the first things to do is to identify who are the parties to the conflict, in particular, who are the parties that have a veto power over any solution. And I think that divides into those parties that legitimately have a stake and a say, and those that illegitimately, through coercion, illegal activity, assassination, or what have you, can prevent moving toward a solution. Because I tend to think that a solution essentially is finding something that in economics we would say is on the contract curve. And any outcome from which you cannot move without harming some party that has veto power. And that leads to the possibility that we are in a rational solution right now. That is to say, it isn't obvious that there is an alternative situation that is sufficiently in the interest of every party that has any legitimate or illegitimate capacity to block or intervene. And I was thinking when we came here that the issue was how many parties are there on the Palestinian side and how many parties are there on the Israeli side? And do we count the United States or Iran or Russia as a party that has some kind of veto power. But you, at the very beginning, make it an Arab-Israeli conflict. And so I was going to suggest maybe the first thing we decide is whether this is really an Israeli-Palestinian conflict or an Arab-Israeli conflict. If it's an Arab-Israeli conflict, then it begins to look like a Western versus Muslim clash of civilizations, or it makes it look as if the United States' interest is not merely in solving an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the United States views this as something much larger than what primarily involves Israel and the Palestinians. So I would say that an important step toward identifying what we mean by a rational solution is to identify who the parties are who have to be satisfied in order that any solution we could identify be achievable.
Thank you. Jon.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. We then would also have to identify the interests of all these parties. What is the interest of the United States in these issues? Not clear to me.
Yes. Anybody would like to address directly these questions? The green one, Joe.
Pressing green one, lean in and lean forward.
I think it's a very good point that we have to start looking at the parties and their interests. And if we start off simply with a Palestinian-Israeli dichotomy, and then begin to break down each side into the kind of specific elements who may influence it, we still have an awful lot of other parties that are going to come into this and also have to be broken down. So the United States, I don't think, is simply one party. There are multiple parties coming in from the U.S. And we can't ignore the Arab states and other Arab actors, which are going to come in on not necessarily as neutral parties into this, but as parties with interests in this as well. So it's a complex game.
Just in case of the U.S., the U.S. has interests, but it also has to be a vital piece of any solution. I cannot imagine any solution in which U.S. pressure or U.S.-funded side payments. I think those are necessary ingredients of any solution. But whether that would be in the U.S. interest, I don't know.
I believe that one of the elements of Tom's remarks is not only how we can break the different actors within these big actors we can call the Americans or the U.S. or the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Israelis, but who has veto power? Because not all may have veto power, which leads us to Danny's school syndrome scenario. Not all may have veto power, not all may want to exercise it. My own idea of framing it as I see the core of the conflict to be the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but I on purpose decided to phrase it as an Arab-Israeli conflict for precisely the reasons that some of you mentioned. For example, Jon, you mentioned about the possibility of the outer circles. We may get to an agreement, and then once we have an agreement, the spoilers will spoil it. And in fact, I see a dramatic asymmetry between building and destroying. That is, it takes so much effort to build, and it's so easy for an outer source to destroy it in a minute, in 2 minutes, with technology and 2 or 3 determined people, sometimes with very rudimentary technology. This is why I wanted to open the circle and talk about the outer circle as well. While some countries have a peace, Arab countries have a peace treaty with Israel, others do not. They are part of the conflict. So I thought, as an opening shot, if you may, I thought that to call it this way. But your remarks are very well taken, Avishai, and after Asari.
I think that the question of the parties and the interests are interrelated. The conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is basically an intercommunal strife. The conflict between Israel and Syria, Israel and Egypt, Israel and the Arab world is among states. In the case of a conflict among states, or between states, the interests are relatively conventionally well defined: territories, water. The conflict in intercommunal strife, everything is at stake, and partly is politics of identities. Because the two communities, the Israelis and the Palestinians, are shaping themselves through the conflict. So I think the nature of the conflict changes when you move from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to Arab-Israeli conflict, in terms of not just the parties, but how the interests are defined. But then there is another element, and that's always was that now with pan-Islamism and the Islamic element changing the nature of the conflict from a national conflict or ethnic conflict into a religious warfare. And it's changing. I don't know at which point we are. But the main thing is that there is a tremendous evocative power to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a recruiting element in the Islamic context. So identifying the parties is almost tantamount to identifying the solution. It's not, you can't really have an independent account of who the parties are and their interests unless you have, we have to talk about all of it simultaneously. They are too interdependent than just to try to isolate. Let's first figure out what the interests are. We have to talk in a messy way on all of it as a package deal. I know it's less tidy, but I don't see the way of let's isolate them, because I think the interaction by now with the Islamic element getting involved into it and the Jewish element into it, among the settlers and others, I find it very hard really to disentangle the conflict to its components, and I find what is so frustrating and maddening about the conflict.
Thank you, Sari.
Okay, I feel like a person who's just been placed on a sledge, one of those slides, and I'm whooshing down, and I haven't really put my thoughts together properly yet, and I want to be in the beginning first, and to determine exactly what's happening. Now, if I understand correctly, what Tom was saying to begin with was that to identify a rational solution, we have to identify who the parties, and he said the legitimate parties, meaning the parties that have veto power, are. And I'm not sure if I understand this correctly. I mean, why is a rational solution connected, and only connected, to who the parties who have veto power are? Surely one can think of rational solutions, depending on what one means by rational solution, in abstraction of what the parties and their interests may be. I'm not sure. I'm asking this loudly. And the second thing is, when I come to think about breaking down the parties in the way that was suggested, and for instance, Joel brought up the United States and said, here we do not have one party, and I imagine he meant two parties. I want to be honest and tell you how I reacted in my mind to what was said over there, which was that there are probably parties in the United States that we cannot even identify. And I mean here not the political parties and not the State Department, but maybe within the CIA or within the, I don't know, Pentagon, organizations that actually run matters and have interests of their own. And in this regard, I want to say that it's not always clear to me that what people do in those organizations is consistent with what one assumes people are trying to do at the level of the State Department or at the level of the political actors. And I can, bring up examples. For example, corruption, which is a disease that we, the Palestinians, have come to suffer from. I would claim partly because of intervention, conscious intervention on the part of certain elements within the United States, not certainly the political parties as such, but certain elements within the United States and maybe certain elements within the Israeli intelligence services. So how does one, to come back to my initial query, identify who the parties are, even within the context of the various countries? So I'm sorry I didn't go along with it's just questions that are
Michael? It's just the mic.
I'll kind of follow up to that, but procedurally, I think he's, okay.
Oh, Yazid put. Oh, I didn't. No, I didn't notice the sign. So.
Rational process.
Okay. So Yazid and then Michael.
He's got a follow-on, so
Yeah.
We just have a kink in our microphone system here, so let me just tell you what it is. When you speak, if you just push the mic, but then when you're finished, push it again,
Yeah.
so that the other person can use it.
Okay.
Okay. I want to follow up on Sari Nusebi's point, because I was also found myself struggling a little bit with the language that Tom introduced. And part of it has to do with that sort of language of veto players. And as I understand it, a lot of that language was introduced in various kinds of democratic, in terms of the study of democratic deliberative processes, in which it was possible to identify veto players within a sort of institutional structure. In that context, then, it's possible, I suspect, then to look at the Israeli and the Palestinian context, look at their political structures, identify the veto players because they've got they got their fingers at various levers in the decision-making process. And I think that's all well and good, but there's a limit to that, especially in the language of spoilers. Because veto players are not the same thing as spoilers, as I understand it. And I worry in this context that we are treating the two as synonyms when in fact we need to unpack that. Because at least in terms of my own autobiography for understanding the conflict, I began by doing the international relations of the Middle East. I left it because I just couldn't take it anymore. I went and studied other parts of the global South, spent a lot of time looking at ethnic conflict and domestic conflicts. We would talk about spoilers, never talked about veto players, so that language is beginning to seep in now. But one of the ways in which those of us who study Civil War have talked about spoilers, and this goes back to Jan's comment about interests, but it has more to do with motivations as opposed to interests, which is, are they acting out of predatory instincts or fear? And it seems to me that part of the problem that goes on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, are these spoilers predatory? So are the Jewish settlers predatory? and is Hamas predatory, or is it on the assumption that the mainstream Israeli and the Palestinian public, when they're acting towards one another, are they acting out of fear? And so part of my plea then, or at least my struggle here, is to analytically unpack this question of veto players from this issue of spoilers, and then ask ourselves, what are the different kinds of motivations that spoilers might have? Because that might help us get a better sense about what are possible or impossible solutions.
I suppose what I want to say follows on a little bit. I'm, like I suppose some of us struggling to fit different terminology together. Going back to the issue of actors, my sense from what I've heard so far is that whatever the actors are, spoilers, veto holders, or other, etc., I don't hear anyone suggesting that any of the actors are fundamentally, let's say, irrational, in the sense that they are driven by something that is beyond reason, pragmatic interest, calculation, whatever. So whether we like them or not, all the key actors in this, whatever they do, however they act, are actors who, if you like, where we can actually apply an analysis. We can understand what they're on about, what they are, who they are ontologically, why they do what they do, and whether you agree with them or confront them. And I think that's a rather important issue here, because obviously we're not getting into rather essentialist ideas, which would suggest that certain actors have natures that are fundamentally different from the natures of the other actors. And that also ties into something, this is not really what I initially wanted to discuss, but I think it's worth coming back to something that Avishai said about religion coming into this. I somewhat disagree in the sense that I don't think that the rise of, say, Jewish religious nationalism or Islamic religious nationalism is something of a fundamentally different nature. Nationalists, whether on the Zionist side or the Palestinian side in the early part of the century, 20th century, or during 1948 or later on, they acted in pretty much broadly the same ways, denied each other, excluded each other, etc. I mean, I'm not convinced that because people use God in their language instead of the nation, that is a fundamentally different type of thing, a fundamentally different type of conflict, and that I agree with Avishai that there is a communal conflict in Israel and Palestine, yes, overlaid with other things, but I don't think that the introduction of Islam or Judaism among settlers in the West Bank, let's say, or Hamas or other, are changing the nature of the conflict either within Israel, Palestine, or regionally. I mean, I very much doubt that Islamization of the Palestine cause is going to bring 10 times as many volunteers to come and fight on the Mujahideen side in Palestine than the nationalist cause did in the 1960s. I mean, there were volunteers from Tunisia or Algeria or Iraq who came to Palestine then. And I don't think that there's a fundamentally different nature here, that sort of Islamizing the conflict regionally involves Iran or Iraq or Sudan or others in this conflict any more than it ever did in the past under other guises. So, which has a bearing, of course, on what we're discussing, because, again, unless we assume that there are fundamental differences in nature of actors and issues and identities when politicized, then it alters how we approach the problem, obviously, and how we approach the solutions. Now, what I really want to focus on for a minute is my sense that all the key actors, all the key issues, all the key identities have been around for a while. They evolve, they change. There are shifts in nature of, I think, yes, in the sense of whether the struggle is about a two-state solution, a one-state solution, an apartheid, a democratic state. The agenda, I think, shifts mostly. But in terms of Palestinians and Israelis living in that particular territory, whether it's Hamas or Fatah, right-wing Israelis or left-wing Israelis, settler types and others, they were there in 93, they were there in the 1980s, they're there right now. Obviously, the combination is different. It's working differently in the political world. There was a timing that somehow worked in the early 1990s that allowed a solution to arise, which was sufficiently adhered to by the key actors, who therefore asserted a dominant paradigm, if you like, of peacemaking. It was challenged. There were events such as Baruch Goldstein and the Hebron Mosque or suicide bombings in 95. There were events that could have derailed and now would derail the process, but then didn't derail the process. So again, I don't think it's purely spoilers could come in at any time and derail everything. That's not true. the overall structure of the conflict or of peacemaking was working in a different way. And I think partly what we suffer now is that the structure is lost. The structure in the sense of the deliberate, conscious policy decisions of key actors, the Israeli government, the Palestinian leadership, the United States administration, and others in 93 or 94 or 99 or whenever, versus now, these key structures are different. The leeway that was allowed people like Hamas by the Palestinian leadership or the settlers by the Israeli government at various times in the past decade have weakened the center, have been acts of abdication, I think, at times by people like Arafat and Barak and so on, allowing the so-called spoilers to move their discourse and their behavior into mainstream politics. So partly I'm discussing the loss of a structure, loss of norms that came with it, the idea of how to regulate conflict, how to deal with problems. These norms were lost. And here I think is where the US, as I argued in my memo, comes in, because the external players who could have assisted in maintaining a sort of normative structure of what is done and how you do it, this gave way, and they allowed the local actors to cheat on the rules, as it were, throughout. The Israelis did with settlements, the Palestinians did with violence for a long while. So I think overall structure, the normative structure, and the incentive structure, i.e. the balance between rewards and penalties, which was not maintained and not applied rigorously through the good years, and therefore, once things went wrong, that incentive structure is now acting in a very dysfunctional manner. And a reminder, finally, that timing is important. What could come together in the 1990s at the international level, end of the Cold War, the Gulf War, and locally the exhaustion of the PLO, various factors, globalization, the business elite in Israel wanting new opportunities, all sorts of things coming together in a way that they don't come together now. And somehow we have to work in timing into our thinking about this.
I think that what we already can distill is a question about periods of time in which spoilers were prevented from being spoilers, even if the spoilers were. And I think we should focus on that. We should try to understand what are the structural conditions and process conditions that, in fact, at a certain period of time, prevented the spoilers from spoiling. We also should try to understand systematically what allowed to this change that you are talking about, Yazid, at the normative level. And I also think that we should, in some sense, ask the question that Tom started, which is, do we really need to can we talk about the impossibility of getting to a resolution because of the large quantity of actors involved as we reduce, as we go inside the Palestinians, inside the Israelis, the Americans, the Lebanese, the Syrians, and so on and so forth. And so I just put it as a question, more or less as you did, whether that is a major problem with a rational solution. Jon and then Avishai.
I want to go back to Tom's opening remark and suggest that in one sense they were a bit too optimistic by phrasing the question in terms of interest. As Albert Hirschman told us in Passions and Interest, that interests are a civilizing force. If the interests are well defined, and if that's all that's at stake, you can find a solution. But when you have passions and when you have principles, it's much, much harder. Now, the question is, take territory. That's an interest, a straightforward interest. Of course, but the sacred land, that's a principle. And as we all know from bargaining theory, it's always in your advantage to present your interest as a principle, because to back down from a principle is a much greater concession, in exchange for which you can demand a much greater concession from the other side. And of course, when both sides do this, there's deadlock. So this goes back to what I said in my memo about strategic posturing. Should we take the talk about the sacred land seriously? No. And how can we know? Sacred land or holy sites or whatever. But If it all were a matter of interest, the problem would have been solved a long time ago. So that's why I agree with Michael. We should talk about motivations, not just about interest.
Just two clarifications. One of the question was what Islamization brings into the conflict. Two elements, actually. One that was just mentioned, and I'll say something about it. One is the element of time. In the case of a secular schedule is 5 years plan. You have to deliver something within 5 years to 10 years. When religion comes into it, then the promise is, the stake is higher and the day of postponement is longer. So first of all, the schedule is different. And I think that it's not politics, but it's a different calendar in politics that Islamization brings into the fore. And the call for patience. It's far more credible when religion calls for patience, namely that the day of payment should be pushed to the future. I'm not just talking about sort of slogans like it took us 200 years to get rid of the Crusaders, it will take us 200 years to get rid of the Jews, eventually we'll get. But the feeling is that the promise is high, and we belong we can enlarge the scope of the conflict being part of the Islamic world. And I think this promise has tremendous resonance in the community. So one is the element of time, another is the element of the sacredness, of the holiness. The whole country is a waqf, it's an endowed religious, and therefore, so sometimes declaring something holy is a strategic move. Sadat declared that every grain of sand in Sinai is sacred. So sometimes sacred means that it's very important to me, you'd better come up. But sometimes, I mean, when a religious element comes into it, it becomes far more credible as a serious claim. And I think that we hear more and more about, on both sides, that it's a waqf or Eretz Kodesh. So I think that these two elements should be taken into account, and our tendency to poo-poo them, well, it's religion and it's basically the same kind of politics that we know, but in just different disguise. I think these two elements are important. As to the issue of the actors, and let me just make more specific why I say the issue of identifying the actors is problematic and it's part of the solution and not just part of the problem. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, and I believe that that's perhaps the only viable thing now, is that the Saudis' plan for peace in the Middle East will be discussed between Israel and the Arab countries. And the Palestinian will be one part in this delegation. In such a case, if the Saudis and the Egyptians especially will agree with the Israelis more or less on the parameters of the Saudi peace initiative, it will be very hard to the Hamas to become spoilers. The pressure on them will be immense. There can be always a jihad. I mean, the Islamic jihad can try to be spoilers. But those elements with real constituency in such a case will be under tremendous pressure. Now, is it the Arab world negotiating with Israel? Is it the Palestinian? It will be a messy story in which you'll have both the Arab state, the Sunni states, and the Palestinian delegation in it. I still believe that this is, if at all, I won't ascribe probabilities, but it's still the only viable plan now. And I don't know how to describe it. Is it Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinian? Is it Israel vis-à-vis the Arab? Is it Israel vis-a-vis the Arab states and the two factions in the Palestinian community, the Hamas and the Fatah? It's hard to tell. And so that's why I say identifying the actors and discussing the solution should be dealt simultaneously.
Switch it off. Um, the issue of who are the parties was raised, and the question of time frame was raised. I want to complicate matters by introducing another element, and that is the level of the element of level, on which level we are speaking. And what I have in mind is a distinction that very often comes and is raised and is sort of struggled with. Are we talking about accommodation, solution, settlement of a problem on a kind of ground level among people? Is it a sort of psychological accommodation that we are looking for first, and then eventually comes the political solution? And it has this way of thinking about it came up in several of the memos when people talk about the fatigue. Right? The solution will come when people are already too tired to go on, and people on the ground are more or less resigned to some pattern of solution, and eventually politicians will come along and figure out a way of codifying it and agreeing to it. Or do we go the other way around? Do we start from sort of top down, in the sense that politics has to be first, and on some level of leadership, whether it's just the Palestinians and Israelis, or Israelis within a framework like the one Avishai said now, the entire Arab world, or the quartet, rather than the United States, kind of mediating some level of negotiations among politicians. And once politicians are able to come up with any kind of an agreed solution, like they tried in the Oslo story, that then people will be carried along. People will come along, and psychological accommodation among the peoples will follow. So the question of what is the way we should think about it? What is more urgent? What is more realistic? The accommodation among people, or a solution among politicians, if a process can be agreed on. I think that this is another helpful thing or question to keep in mind. And there was another point I wanted to make. I'll come back to it when I remember it. Thank you.
Yon has a tool. Let's adopt the convention of one and two fingers. Follow up by two fingers. I mean follow up. Yon, please, has a two.
Oh, just depressing observation. I agree with Edna that fatigue can be a condition for peace. In the French Wars of Religion, that's what happened in the 1590s. After 30 years of killings on a scale that far exceeds what we see in the Middle East or in Palestine and Israel today. And even then, the peace lasted only for 80 years.
Make sure to just look at me first.
Yes. I just wanted to comment on two things that were said. First of all, on Edna's point, I think that's a very good point, that we do have to differentiate between levels, but it's a very complex interaction. So what is happening at the ground level, and particularly not only fatigue, but also changes in structural changes at the social level of society. are going to affect the political configurations, the nature of leadership, the possibility of how politics are formed. And then those politicians, once they get into the game, are going to affect those people below. So it's, I think it's a very good distinction, and it's a complex game. I wanted to also comment a little bit on just starting with what Emmanuel said, that the spoilers can spoil things in a minute, but it takes a very long time to build. And it's also, I think, refers to a point that Yazid made. I think that's true, but it's not always true. And it's true at different times. And I wonder if we don't hit a point. Let me just back up a second and say that I imagine when there will be a solution, that it's not going to be a solution that satisfies everyone, and that there are going to be people who are going to be trying to destabilize and continue this conflict even after we have signed agreements and even after procedures are in place. And that's the way it's going to be. But I think that at that point, if the commitment is there, if the structures are in place, if the agreement is in place, it's going to be very hard for those spoilers to spoil. And I think at a certain point you hit perhaps even a tipping point where the level of negotiations, even if you don't have an agreement yet, but where the negotiations are at a point where the process is at a point where there's a sense of inevitability, that it becomes harder and harder for the naysayers to either spoil or veto. So especially veto, but even spoil. So you have to look at the dynamic of the process itself as this unfolds.
Tom would like the floor. Let me just say something, and maybe afterwards provoke Janice into stepping in, because the question of emotions that Yon has raised, and what you have raised in response to, this asymmetry between regress and progress, is in part also a problem of technology and a problem of how a few people, I'm not talking, in an organized way, whether it's the settlers or Hamas, or it's just a couple of people. That's what, in fact, Danny challenges, in a sense of just one school full of children, and this goes back to the emotions, and to know whether, how much can the process then be protected from these emotions, how much these sacred things are posturing or are not, because in a sense, and this is why I'm after Tom's intervention, I'm calling Janice in, because she says, well, that may not be a problem. And so first Tom, and then if Janice would like to respond. Thank you.
Tom.
First, just terminologically, when I spoke of veto power, I didn't mean legal political veto power. I meant the kind of thing that a Jewish law student did when he assassinated the prime minister. When I spoke about interests, I think I meant to include what you referred to as passions, religions, and so forth, but I think it's worth distinguishing. I like Edna's notion, which is possibly we have the solution. We just have to wait. And if in the end we get 80 years of peace, who's to complain? But I would like to formulate this question. Suppose the Palestinians, whoever they are, all of those who have some capacity to withhold consent, and the Israelis, whoever they are, who have the capacity to withhold consent, suppose they arrived at an understanding, at a, quote, solution. Are there neighboring nations, or even non-neighboring nations, that would attempt to spoil it? Would the United States object? Would Egypt object? Would Iran object? I prefer this formulation because even in talking about the U.S. interest, I think the U.S. has a very strong interest in getting some kind of settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. But if it becomes part of the whole Arab-Israeli, or the Israeli-Arab issue, all of a sudden the United States finds that the Israeli-Palestinian interests may fade compared with what they're trying to do in Afghanistan and Iraq and what they're worried about in Iran and what the relations are with Saudi Arabia. So that I think that if we accept Emmanuel's formulation that it's an Arab-Israeli conflict, then I don't know what kind of settlement we're looking for. But if we could believe that a settlement between Israelis and Palestinians would be accepted by Egypt, by Syria, by Iran, by the USA, by Russia, by any interested party, then it seems to me we could work on what looks to me more like a soluble problem. Whereas if we have to settle relations between Israel, the United States, Russia, and all the Middle East powers, including those like Saudi Arabia and Iran who may have their own conflicts, that I think makes it too big a problem to identify a solution.
Thank you. Edna and Michael then, these are two things.
2 points. One relating to the question of whether passions, emotions, sacredness, religion, whether they are, whether they can be bundled up with interests, whether they're separate, what do we do with them? The way I see them acting out in this particular conflict has to do with, I think, it was Yazid who said nobody talked about irrationality. Was it Yazid or was it the Joel?
Yeah,
Yazid was, right. I think that here we border on irrationality. I think that part of the tremendous problem of suicide bombers was not just the number of people killed. I think it introduced an element that was terrifying to all of us thinking about the process, not just being victims of it in one way or another, that once elements of we have nothing to lose enter the picture, then it's outside of the realm of rationality, it's outside of interests. That's the way I think of it. Interests, as Jon said, interests are civilizing influence because when we have interests, we know how to bargain, and we know, the framework is relatively clear, even if it's difficult to grapple with it. The terms of reference are clear. But when we talk about having nothing to lose, and acting on this notion of having nothing to lose, I think that this goes beyond interests. And once it goes beyond interests, whether you want to call it passion or out of religious motivation, once it transcends the notion of interest, then we are beyond rationality, and then we really don't know how to handle it. And I think that this is part of the problem that was introduced into the conflict by the suicide bombers. Also with religion, it's not only that a religious element or sacredness enters into the picture, it's once you have the notion of the sacred, then compromise goes out the window. If both sides think about the Temple Mount, the sacred, how is it called? The sacred Agana Kadosh, the sacred basin of what these Jews call the Temple Mount and the Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif. Once both sides say that this is beyond negotiation, this is beyond compromise, there is not going to be ever any kind of compromise on something like this, then there's no bargaining and interests don't enter the picture. Once it's put on such a level that it goes beyond bargaining or interests. So to me, introducing the religious element, as opposed to the way Yazid said before, he said, well, I don't see the recruiting power of religion being any more significantly larger than the recruiting power of national slogans in the 60s, I think that I see it different. I think that differently. I think that it's not a question of how many divisions will be recruited by the religious call rather than by the national call, but it's that it affects the nature of whether we're talking within framework of interests or transcending it into realms of irrationality. So this is one point. The other point I wanted to make was the following. We started quite appropriately by sort of widening our horizons and throwing in lots of elements. And Avisha even said we can't talk about things linearly. We have to talk about everything simultaneously, which is not possible technically to do. But of course, the point was that we have to consider all these elements because they're interrelated. Let me try a reverse exercise and say something that I think came out in my memo too, but may have been misrepresented. It is not the Oslo process that I think we would do well to discuss, but it's something that I cannot turn my mind off it when I come to think about the process, and this is the failure of what happened at Camp David, not just the entire Oslo Accord, but the Camp David. And when I talk about Camp David, I really talk about the first phase, the September, what was it? July, August of 2000, before the Intifada started. What happened there? And I don't want to start discussing it, just mention this as a point. I think that I cannot think about this solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict without trying to come to terms with why were we that close to a solution then, A? Were we really that close to a solution? And what was the solution that we were so close to? And why did it not come about? Who spoiled it? What spoiled it? Were we close to it? Could it have been acted out differently? And what can we learn from it? To me, this is a very specific point with very specific actors, very specific plans on the table. What went wrong?
Thank you very much. We have Janice, Mike, and Jon. So please.
Michael, you have to be patient. My two fingers.
And Yazid.
Let me disagree with Edna about sacralization. And I think it's a non-trivial point, how we think about this. If we look back at history, in the sense that Jan was taking us, there have been long periods of history where deeply religious societies negotiated. And they negotiated explicitly and they negotiated tacitly. And arrangements about sacred places, arrangements about what is sacred, what is not sacred, what is considered sacred, how it is considered sacred, evolved through those negotiations and those conversations. So I think we're going to make a category error if we argue that the sacred precludes negotiation. It never has in any society. And I'm not at all persuaded that it does in this situation. And I think if we go there quickly, we are in fact foreclosing a solution. That's the first point. I want to turn your question around and ask, does sacralization create an opportunity for discussion that didn't exist before? Again, if we and I think the word passion matters here, because to talk only about suicide bombers, to equate suicide bombers, if that becomes the totality of the sacred, or Jewish settlers become the totality of the sacred within the Jewish context, that's too narrow. There's a broad array of sacred actors in both societies. And among many of them, there is, in fact, a real possibility of negotiation and conversation. So how we think about that, it seems to me, is going to matter. I think that I was saying this last night to Tom, and I don't know how sympathetic he was. I think that we have great difficulty in dealing in the concepts that we have with religion as a political force and with religion as a strategic political force that acts in the world. And I think we will miss a great deal if we blind ourselves by our own very particular heritage, or the way we look at it. So that's my first point. The second point, and as you were talking, I cannot help but think, and Jan's example is an excellent one, but take modern Ireland. It was a religious conflict. It was all sacred. The discourse between Catholics and Protestants, to anyone who is outside that conversation, it was impossible to comprehend. And yet social movements within society, whether it was fatigue, which was a factor, and it wasn't on the scale, in comparative scale, Jan, that you mentioned, but nevertheless, social dynamics eventually led the process of conflict resolution. It didn't follow, it actually led. And when we think in terms of strategic interaction, it's an easier model if it's government to government, if it's the top-down model that you mentioned. To think strategically from the bottom up is much more difficult because our models are not as well developed. But it's actually, I think, a very important point here. I mean, look again at persistent public opinion data in Palestine and in Israel, which despite everything that's happened, you get consistent majorities that still favor a negotiated solution. So there's a disconnect here that we have to wrap our heads around, it seems to me, Emmanuel, and it has to very much, and that's my third question. I want to turn Tom's question around. I understand why Tom said, who has veto power? Because veto power, and it's different from spoilers, right? It really is. But it's not, I think Tom meant closer to spoilers, didn't you, in your question?
And anybody who can prevent it by any means.
Right. So I think that's closer to the way we would understand spoilers. Let's flip the question over and ask who has agency, right? That's an important question. It is, and we don't talk about it. We worry. It is. I think we're starting at the dark end of the tunnel. Who has agency? Where do we see the lead coming that would, in fact, thrust forward a process to stretch the boundaries? I would argue, in fact, that the literature on the Middle East is full of spoiler literature. I think it's wrong. I actually think, were there to be a viable agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, it would be virtually impossible for outsiders to spoil it. So the focus should, for me, is on agency and where we see agency.
Okay, thank you. We have Mike, Jon, and Tom, and then Joel.
And Yazid.
And Yazid. No, sorry. No. We have Mike, Jon, Yazid, and Joel. Sorry. And I need to be excused. I need to make an urgent call. Can you continue to?
Yeah, give me the list.
Yeah.
Give me the list. Mike?
It's Mike,
Mike.
Jon, Yazid, and Joel.
Oh my gosh, yes, is this notion of a herding stalemate. A herding stalemate, which comes to us from Bill Zartman. And boy, if there's just one concept I'd love to throw out, especially when it comes to the Middle East, that would be it. In part because I can't tell you how many times I've encountered pundits and scholars saying, we've reached the herding stalemate. And this has been over decades now, so let's just acknowledge that we can't identify it except in a post hoc way. To Edna, I guess I was a little concerned about, and maybe I'm just sort of not quite comprehending it, but the language of interests versus the language of irrationality. And the language in which it seems, and maybe I'm just, again, I want to understand this, in which religion almost becomes defined as part of the irrational or the passionate. And I think if we move in that direction, we're in real trouble. Because at least I operate with a much more Weberian conception of rationality, in which rationality can take on different kinds of substantive elements depending on cultural context. So it's actually not hard for me. I mean, I can understand why it is that the victims of suicide bombing may view suicide bombers as completely irrational. But I'm not sure that I'm necessarily ready to say that within the cultural worldview of suicide bombings and those who support it, that those who engage in it are necessarily irrational. In the same way that, frankly, I just came back from Fort Leavenworth talking to a bunch of the folks who are either cycling in or cycling out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And, one of the things that I'm always impressed by whenever I meet with those in the military is their willingness to sacrifice for others. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily view that those who are part of a group setting who are ready to sacrifice, really sacrifice for their comrades, are necessarily irrational. So I worry about going down that road. The other one comes up with, Avishai's mentioned and Tom's mentioned in terms of how we think about this relationship between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab conflict. And I agree with both somewhat contradictory points that Avishai made, which is on the one hand, yes, it's intercommunal versus interstate, yet they're also deeply porous games in the sense that they are nested. And so, this obviously makes any kind of solution much more difficult. But one of the things that many of us have, I guess, as we dream utopic or not, or utopic thoughts, is this notion that there may be nested games here, but also the nested solutions, which of course then leads many people like Kissinger and others to think about grand bargains, which came up in Lebanon, after Lebanon. If we can get Israel to deal with Syria, will Syria deal with Hezbollah? And then what would Hezbollah get? Israel then deals with the Palestinian issue. And so you can imagine then this kind of grand strategic bargain in which these different games are related to one another and everybody gets something as a consequence. And that's always, I think, because we see these as nested games, because we see the strategic linkages between them, and because the parties insist on making these kinds of strategic linkages, leads us many times to think about potentially nested solutions.
Okay, just on that, and I am anyway, but this is a two-finger separately from my one finger, under 1 minute. We have a very concrete example of the grand nesting, which is the Madrid Peace Conference, where the idea was to bring in the Syrians and the Jordanians and the Lebanese and the Palestinians along with the Israelis, and to deal with economics and water and refugees and environment and all the rest. And I mean, I think that was very much an example of precisely that. It occurred within a very specific strategic moment and led by the United States. So, I mean, there was a lot. It makes sense, but it makes sense, of course, when someone's going to take that on. But what I wanted to come back to is, well, first I want to come back to this issue of what religion adds or doesn't add to this. I take the points about timing and sacralization, but I'm still not convinced that that is fundamentally new in and of itself. In that, for instance, if you look at the issue of time and postponement, I think that's a very important point. But every nationalist movement does that. I mean, Zionism established a connection, labor Zionism, with 2,000 years of history with ancient Israel, sort of explaining the present. Arab nationalism speaks of an immortal nation. There was the 1,000-year Reich. Everyone has a very long perspective in these things. I think Edna also made a very important point about religious people being less willing to compromise, and I think that is very important. But again, I do think that's something shared with nationalists. I mean, was there anything less compromising than Nazi views of humanity? I mean, we had something as big as the Holocaust and all the other millions who died, based on something that had nothing to do with the church and God and wasn't rationalized in that way, but was immensely more horrific than anything we've seen in any religious conflict. So, I mean, in terms of absoluteness and unwillingness to compromise, I'm just not convinced that we need necessarily. I'm not saying there isn't something about religion. And certainly people scare me in the US, for instance, who seek Armageddon. I mean, they want to hasten it. And there are people like that on the Islamic side, Al-Qaeda, or Jewish zealots in the West Bank, who in each of these cases arguing that their authority, which is God and his text, is above that of the state or the government. And that's scary. Certainly when people in America say this, when people in the West Bank say this, when people in Iraq or Palestine say this. That's scary. But again, I don't think that is new, because every nationalist also said that. In the name of the nation, there's something above the secular temporal authorities of the day with which that person disagrees. It does, yes, set people aside in that they'll do much more horrific things with less observance of norms and limitations and room for compromise. I just don't think that someone, by being Islamic or Jewish or Hindu, is doing something in that sense that is more than was done previously and will still be done by other people in this pretty much the same manner. We will face people like that. Where I think I'm most struck by what I heard, this thing about the suicide bombing, now I think that's a very good case of something which steps over a certain line, and I would go along with that. Certainly my visceral reaction to it is very much the same. But I think it's worth, from our perspective, sitting here at a safe distance from all this, to put this in context. Now, I don't mean the usual context that Palestinians talk about, which is remember the occupation and da-da-da. No, a different context, which is that much of the suicide bombings, leaving aside the personal motivation of individuals and the psychology that drives people to do what they see as some sort of dramatic act, which will draw attention to themselves in a way. But for the movements behind this, in particular movements like Hamas, I think there's a more complex issue here, and I would argue this. In a way, we're talking about something I've been sort of itching to discuss, I hope we can discuss, which is deterrence, which, if you like, is the optimum rational thing to do, yet used in this conflict is often used in ways that are actually fundamentally irrational. And Tom and Janice certainly are the people who've worked on this. And Janice, for instance, I'm using your chapter on why deterrence failed in '67 and so on. We have a situation where, on the one hand, Hamas quite openly is trying to alter the rules of the game. And it uses suicide bombings as a means of establishing a new form of deterrence, a new form of fear, mutual fear, which then deters. And they've been very explicit about this. And they've also been disciplined about not shooting or firing rockets or conducting suicide bombings when they feel they've established a certain balance of some sort, a certain parity. On the other side, I was struck very much last summer by what I heard coming out of Israel in the reaction to Hezbollah's abduction on the 12th of July and the whole thing, and how much was said about deterrence and restoring Israeli deterrence. And there's a fundamental issue here, which is that deterrence works, ideally it works, when you've established a commonly understood set of norms and behaviors that are accepted on both sides, whatever the other feelings about this are. But here we have a situation where deterrence is actually a lot of the time just pure punishment. It's how dare they challenge us. We're going to beat them until we sear this into their consciousness, this sort of attitude, which is rather different. Now, that's passion and that's irrational, I think. And it's particularly irrational if deterrence is about trying to maintain a status quo that freezes fundamentally problematic relationships and issues like occupation or otherwise, or that Israel should sort of sit there and be expected to take bombings and do nothing back to the Palestinians. I mean, both sides have irrational concepts of what deterrence is in their situation. So I think suicide bombings and so on, yes, they are a very important angle which does start to cross over the line. But if we look at it in context, I think there's a deterrence establishing dialogue or misdialogue that's going on here between the two sides that fundamentally keeps distorting what's going on and how to resolve it.
Yeah, what I'm going to say started as a two-finger intervention, but many things happened since then. So can I turn it into a one-finger comment? Well, on the last point of Tom's book, Arms and Influence is still the Bible, so you might want to comment on this.
About deterrence.
Now, on rationality, I have to say I agree with Michael and with Yazid and disagree with Edna. I think suicide bombings, in one important sense, are perfectly rational. They are patriotic acts. During the Second World War, some people with disabilities hid them to be ordered to be able to serve in the army against Hitler, to defend democracy. It was not irrational. They had a goal, and they were willing to pay the price. Now, what I am more worried about, as I say in my memo, is the cognitive irrationality on both sides, but perhaps especially on the Palestinian side. And I cite in my memo Article 22 of the Hamas Charter, which, if read seriously, literally, is a massive instance of cognitive irrationality. So if there is that kind of cognitive irrationality, either among leaders or in the population on one or both sides, or part of the population on both sides, what do I know, then that seems to be constitute a massive obstacle to agreement and solution. Then I had a second point about negotiating over the sacred. I think it's very hard, Janice. Here's an instance. In September 1561, just before the French Wars of Religion began seriously, there was an attempt to bargain between Calvinists and Catholics over statues representing the Holy Family and the saints, which the Calvinists thought were a form of idolatry, but which the Catholics insisted on. And the bargain deal that was struck was we could have statues outside, not outside of the church, but not inside. It broke down almost instantly. So there was a bargain struck, but it was very unstable. And I think I'm challenging you to come up with a single instance of successful bargaining over the sacred. So maybe there are, but I know it's very hard. Finally, I would like to bring into the debate what I thought was one of the most important observations made in the memos, namely Edna's and Avishai's point about common knowledge. And here there could actually be a practical implementation, because if I'm right, I looked for this on the web. If I'm right in that there are no polls asking Palestinians, how many Israelis do you believe would accept the 67 borders and vice versa? If there are no such polls about beliefs about beliefs, then they should be commissioned. I think that's a fundamental point.
We have Tom, Joel, and Abishai.
Is there room for
Yeah,
quick
these are all
points?
two.
It was a one-sider.
Oh, okay, thank you. So it's a two, right? One? Okay, Abishai then, and then we'll go back to Tom and to Joel. Thank you. Abishai.
Two quick points. Well, since it's a reaction to Janice, I'll mention it later. And first, there is a fallacy of composition about the rationality of the suicide bombing. It may be, I think, irrational to carry the operation and yet be rational to send someone to do it as a political or deterrence or whatever. So I believe, in the Edna's point, is the way I understand it, that the issue is not people are doing very daring things in combative situation, taking tremendous risks. The difference between high risk, very high risk, and committing suicide is very different in terms of the signal that it conveys. It's really the certainty about it makes all the difference in the world. And it conveys one particular message: we have nothing to lose. And the nothing to lose means, but in a serious way, nothing to lose conveys the idea that, well, you can't deal with us. And this ties with the issue. I think there is a conceptual relation between the notion of the holy and the sacred and the non-compromise. This doesn't mean that religion didn't compromise. The church, Richelieu made a deal with the Protestants against the state of the Pope. Salah ad-Din, when he was approached by the Crusader to have a hold in Jerusalem, later on he said it's holy, but 40 years after, his grandson sold it. So religion do all sorts of things cynically. The point is, when religion is taken seriously, not when, there are lots of cynics in religion that do all sorts of things, and usually they compromise and did all sorts of deals. The point is when it is taken seriously. I think that now there are at least credible elements that take it seriously. And it's not just a routine use of language. I think there is the evocative power of the holy, and the sacred is there. And that's a very different, very different mode of operation when you take it seriously. And this has to do with with political theology of secularist, national secularist. Obviously, all secular movements, national movements, used religious language and adopted this view and many of the sort of the metaphors and the symbols. The point, still there is a difference when you just try to recruit something that you're so successful in another religion, or you basically, that's the essence, I mean, the fixed point of your belief. I believe that something happened something happened with the rise of the Islam recently, which is, I think, it's a change. I didn't say that you can't deal. I didn't say that religion don't deal. That wasn't the issue. You missed, I'll repeat one point. There is a conceptual relation, not a category mistake, a conceptual relation between the holy and what is not for compromise. That's a conceptual relation. That's what holy means. It doesn't mean that people who advocated holy, well, didn't negotiate. Either they said, well, Jerusalem is holy, then they contracted to the holy of the holies to the temple, then to the holy of the holies. There are lots of strategies to deal with the holy. Or as the Crusaders, they removed the heavenly Jerusalem to heaven. I mean, people do all sorts of things. The point is that I think, it will be, I think, a state of denial not to take seriously that political Islamism is a real force and not just a replacement of pan-Arabism that was in the area, or some kind of Leninist leftism that was in the area. I think something happened. It's more credible. The reason why those movements are more credible because they really have a direct appeal to the passions, the emotions of white people, and it's not just an elite movement. And in that sense, I think something happened, and without addressing it and just saying business as usual, I think business are not as usual.
I have Tom and Joel, and we are approaching 11. So after Tom and Joel, we are going to go for a 15-minute coffee break. And when we return, we haven't talked much about identity. We have talked about rationality, the actors. I would like to call your attention then after when we return to try to link identity to these issues. So Tom and Joel then. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm still on the kick that I like the idea of trying to find the narrowest definition of the problem we can, because then it may be soluble. Yoon referred to the 30 Years' War. I'd like to refer to the 7 Years' War, and not the one that engaged what is now Canada with the colonies to the south, but the one that took place in Southeast Asia half a century ago. See, my belief is that the sacred, the uncompromisable, and so forth, are not merely existentially there. They're often created, they are escalated, they are generated, they are exaggerated. The United States participated in letting almost 60,000 of its own people die in Vietnam, and we don't know how many millions of Vietnamese died, all because Lyndon Johnson came to believe and persuaded people that he believed it, that the war was not simply against the Viet Cong, but was part of the Cold War. His national security advisor, who was a good friend of mine, explained to me that the 17th parallel was just as sacred as the 38th parallel had been in Korea, and that if we didn't hold at the 17th parallel, the residents of Berlin wouldn't trust us, the Greeks would be afraid we wouldn't defend them against Bulgaria, the Turks would be afraid we wouldn't defend them against the Soviets, and we would have lost the whole Cold War. And he referred to the Moscow, Beijing, Hanoi axis. And from about 1963 on, there was no Moscow, Beijing axis, let alone a Hanoi part of the axis. There's no evidence that Ho Chi Minh ever thought of himself as being involved in a Cold War that was part of the Soviets and the Chinese. He elevated the war into a test of whether small-statured, brown-colored, patriotic, underdeveloped people could hold out against a big, fat, white, capitalist, rich country. And he sort of proved it. Those were the days when Khrushchev used to say that democracies like America didn't have the stamina to fight in a people's war. He didn't realize that the Soviet Union wouldn't either when it became their turn in Afghanistan. Now, the reason we were in that war for so long was not that it really was part of the Cold War, but Lyndon Johnson escalated what was at stake. And in order to persuade whoever needed persuasion that we would never stop fighting, he had to erect it into a principle that transcended anything that was going on in Southeast Asia. It had to do with the honor of the United States, its commitment to NATO, and everything else. And essentially, we were stuck in Vietnam not because there was really something at stake as precious as the Potsdam Agreement, which is the term that Walt Rostow used in saying what this was all about. We were there because the purpose, the stated purpose, was escalated to make it a global conflict testing the United States. It recently happened. President Bush frequently tries to explain that what we are doing in Iraq is fighting terrorism over there so we don't have to fight it at home. And I think he found it necessary to elevate certain objectives, including the war on terrorism, to include what he's trying to do in Iraq. And this leads me to believe that whenever people or governments or leaders get committed to something that is sacred, uncompromisable, it's very often that they have found good reason to elevate it to that status. Very often in order to make clear to an adversary that we can never concede. There's too much at stake here for us. And I think in many ways what we have to try to dismantle is a belief in what you might call the sacredness of everything at stake that has substantially been created for what you might call political or bargaining purposes. And it isn't necessarily so that these things have to be so uncompromisable, but that they have been escalated deliberately into that status. Escalated in such a way that the people who did the escalation come to believe it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom.
Larger point, thank you. First of all, I thought it was interesting that Jan referred to Tom's book, Arms and Influence, as the Bible in this context. This is a sacralization of within academia. You know, my point is going to be that we really should not make a kind of either-or distinction. And I think I tried to put this into my memo as well. An either-or distinction between sacred kinds of politics and normal distributive politics. But we also should not ignore that difference. And I kind of think back to the World War II and the Japanese. First of all, the issue of the kamikaze pilots there, I think, is very instructive for this whole issue of is is suicide bombing different from someone who puts himself at high risk? But also, I think about but I was thinking more specifically about the end where there really was a kind of sacred principle of no surrender by the Japanese. And there is some interesting work now coming out of based on the archives there, of how various generals and politicians worked to desacralize this issue and approach the emperor about it in the couple of months before the end of the war. So this is, and I also think of Ian Lustig's book, which talks about how issues move from the kind of unspeakable, that is, you cannot really talk about them in policy terms, let's do this, let's do that, because they are, whatever you want to call them, sacralized, hegemonic, simply can't be questioned, to a point where they can be questioned. So there is a kind of spectrum here. And then when I talked about the redemptive politics there in my memo, and I don't see a distinction. Maybe we could talk more about this. I don't see a distinction between redemptive politics that's nationalist politics and redemptive politics that's religious politics. Both of them have this very uncompromising quality to them, but like in the Japanese case, they do move, and they move in interesting ways, and that's part of, I think, what we want to understand. And I think looking at Hamas over the last year has been a very interesting one in a kind of moving scale for them. In any case, that wasn't my point, so that was just a reaction. My point was really to address something that Janice said, and also Edna was looking at when she said, what happened at Camp David? And I think that's a very good question, a very good way to start. And I wanted to pick up also on what Janice said about we keep looking at the dark end of the tunnel, and maybe we should look at the light end of the tunnel. So that's what I'm going to do for a second, and say I think we're in a much different place in 2007 from what we were in 1987. In the course of 20 years, we've had a tremendous change in the parameters of this conflict. Many failures have occurred, and I'm not going to dismiss those. I'll talk about just mention them a little later. But I think that also many things that make the possibility of a rational solution possible have occurred in those 20 years, and particularly in the Oslo process. I see the Oslo process as a very, very positive process in many ways. For one, each side accepted the legitimacy of the other and accepted the other's narrative on an official level. And on an unofficial level, during the course of the process, in the 1990s, at least on the Israeli side, I can't comment on the Palestinian side, there was an acceptance of the narrative, of the Palestinian narrative, in the sense not that they absorbed it and agreed with it, but accepted its legitimacy as a narrative, that the issue of al-Nakba, the issue of that there is a Palestinian people, there is a Palestinian nation, the whole gestalt was, I think, accepted on a very basic level in Israel that was astounding to me, truly astounding. And I can give some personal anecdotes, but we don't have time now, that really brought it home, but it also, I think, could see it in polls and other ways. The idea that the Palestinians, for the first time, had their own governing authority, for whether it was corrupt or whether its institutions have been battered and failed. This is an extraordinarily important element. And to go back to this accepting the legitimacy, the fact that in 1991 the Israelis were not willing even to talk to Palestinians, that the Madrid conference had to, come this way to have Palestinians and Israelis sit down in a room together, and to where we are today, I think these are tremendous differences that each side is willing to, of course, we're ready to negotiate. We're ready to have the prime minister and the president sit down with each other. The fact that they renounced violence as a principle, even if they didn't in practice. That in fact they said, each accepted that its own national goals could be reached, I should say, without armed conflict. This was a major change for Palestinians and Israelis alike. So the fact that Oslo mobilized multitudes of negotiations that are still going on at tier 2 and people-to-people levels, and lawyers talking and clerics talking with each other. So I think that the parameters of the period we have now are so fundamentally different from what they were half a generation ago, that in fact the idea of rationality is much more possible. Now, that's all offset by the sacralization of the conflict over these last years, the failure at Camp David, the growth in settlements, the introduction of suicide bombings and other things which are tremendous impediments. So I don't want to say we're well on the way and it's all going to happen, and also the lack of a credible leadership that could bring each side together. But I think that if we could imagine a configuration which could bring the sides together with the kind of proper international pressure, so many things have been solved already that we are not that far from a solution. And therefore, Edna's question, what went wrong at Camp David, becomes a manageable question because so many things had happened by that time.
Thank you very much. I think this brings in the question of time also, and how much time, if indeed this is true, how much time do we have for this rational and rationalizing process to take their course before spoilers and various other factors, maybe in Yazid terms, completely change the nature of where we are, the nature of the process itself, without us really realizing. That is, that's what I meant by trying to fight the old peace, whereas, as we hear from Avishai and others, maybe the situation is drastically changing. But we are going to adjourn for 15 minutes. We'll have some coffee, and we'll return then to continue with the problems. Thank you very much.